Good day, Pete and Ian.
Good
Hello.
morning, Adrian.
It's been a while since we've done one of these, but some things have been coming up recently that I think deserve our undivided attention. So this episode really is based upon an article that our friend and guest speaker today, Ian Reynolds from Secure Team, wrote back in August last year, and it involves a lot of the Microsoft Teams social engineering attacks that he wrote about in his article in August of last year. So to get things started, brief introduction again. I'm Adrian McGarry of Ascot London. Pete.
Yeah, Peter Wood of Naturally Cyber and various other things.
And Ian.
Thanks, Adrian. I'm Ian Reynolds. I am the principal cybersecurity consultant at Secure Team. We're predominantly a pen test company, GRC company, and all things cyber.
Excellent. So to start the conversation off, really, let's talk a bit about this Microsoft Teams, what essentially is a token and credential theft. And Ian, seeing as you are the originator of the article and prominent pen tester, can you firstly explain to us what a replay token attack is, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, I'm sure you've probably familiar with things like session hijacking, but for anybody watching this that isn't familiar with that type of attack, it's essentially where a token is captured by an attacker. A session token. So when you log into a website, the web server normally generates a session token, which is stored in the user's browser. And then for all subsequent requests that are made to the web server after that to the application, the session token goes with that request, so that the server and the application knows that the user is the genuine user. Essentially, with a replay token attack, and maybe we could use an example that we put in the article last year. So this was an attack. It's not a new attack by any means. There's always different ways of packaging up the same attack. I think it's fair to say this was an attack that came from a group named Midnight Blizzard, which it's believed that they are part of Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, also known as SVR. They're responsible for quite a lot of malware attacks throughout the world, so all through Europe, Central Asia, and USA, and we're responsible for things like Magic Web and Foggy Web, which I think we're going to come on to later on in the chat this morning. Essentially, what the objective of a lot of these attacks is to try and gather more information from private and public sector organizations of all sizes, really. Although the attacks that we put in the article last year seem to be more targeted around small businesses, which is quite interesting, probably because generally small businesses don't generally have the budget for huge cybersecurity protection mechanisms and firewalls and IPS and threat intelligence and all this type of stuff. Although there are options now for small businesses around that, but really the attacks originated against small businesses originally. So the replay token attack that happened within this time period, really it started off with good old social engineering. Which it's still the surefire way to get into organizations, even if they have MFA and other security mechanisms on top of that. So essentially what the attackers did was they used social engineering through phishing emails or other mechanisms to get a set of valid credentials. So that's the important part. So this attack could only take place if they already had a set of valid credentials. So maybe a login form or sort of fake login form where they asked for the username and password, something like that. So at some point the victim would have fallen prey to one of these types of social engineering attacks. One clever thing they did in the attackers' case is they actually set up their own Microsoft tenant. Now, when you do that, if you don't assign a custom domain, so we use Microsoft 365, we've obviously assigned our secureteam.co.uk domain to that tenant. If you don't do that, then you're granted a default domain essentially with titled onmicrosoft.com.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
so it could be something like bobsburgers.onmicrosoft.com, and that would be the subdomain that's created by default. So it's a clever thing, and Pete, you go back years with with your sort of social engineering talks that you've done, but it's still the same technique that we're seeing these days, where the attacker will actually change to a domain name that looks like it's something believable. So when the request comes in, the user looks at it and goes, "Oh, it's okay. That's a message from Microsoft, so that seems legitimate." And that's what they were doing. So they were targeting the victims of the social engineering attack that appeared to come from a reputable domain. Now, when they did that, now they've got a set of valid credentials. The attacker themselves then tries to log into the Microsoft tenant. So they use the credentials that the user has submitted to them, and they make an attempt to log in. Now, by default, I think default settings in Microsoft 365 now are that MFA is enabled by default. I think that came in last year, I think it was. So any access to that account is going to prompt for an MFA prompt. In the situation of this attack, what happens essentially is when you log in, you're prompted to enter a number into the Microsoft Authenticator app. So it could be like, let's just use 21 for argument's sake. So the attacker tries to log into the Microsoft tenant. They're prompted for MFA, and they get a message from Microsoft that says enter 21 into your Microsoft Authenticator app. At that point, what they do is they send a message to the victim over Teams, which says their MFA configuration's changed and they need to re-authenticate. Now, part of this message, they provide them with the number they need to get into the victim's account. So in our case, 21. The victim then enters that into their MFA Authenticator app, and that essentially authenticates the attacker on their side into the portal, into the Microsoft portal. And at that point, they've passed MFA, so they've passed the barrier that would have been to get in. Essentially, there's a couple of things that the victim would also need to do to get to this stage. So by default, if you're an external user to an organization that uses Microsoft 365, if you send a message to somebody who's not part of your organization, they need to accept the message first of all. So it will say, somebody has sent you a message from this person, do you want to accept it? Again, social engineering could be used for that. So they might look on LinkedIn and find another employee that might work at the same organization and say, oh yeah, it's John Smith. I know John, he works in finance. I'm going to accept the message from him. So there's definitely an element of social engineering which goes along with this attack. But essentially, once that's done, the attacker is then granted access under whatever permissions that user has into their Microsoft tenant.
Excellent. So it's not just a case of stealing the token, it is also using social engineering tactics to get the user to interact with basically a fake authentication as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to state as well what type of token is being stolen in this type of attack. So in order for a session token to be stolen, so that's the tokens that are stored in cookies normally in the browser, and they're sent to the web server. Really, there's only two ways that you can, there's maybe more, but two ways I can think of that you would be able to get the session token. One would be through something like cross-site scripting. So if you've got a poorly configured web app, the session token can be stolen through that method. But then also if you have a compromised workstation or a compromised browser, that can essentially, if you have full admin rights to a workstation, you can get into the browser cache and you can steal the cookies and the session tokens from that as well. Obviously, in Microsoft's case, I'm sure Microsoft 365 is pen tested to death, and it's probably not got things like cross-site scripting and cookie token issues, although I'm quite sure some of the bug bounty guys will manage to find something along the way. So in this type of attack, it's essentially the token, it's the MFA token that is being sent to the user. That's the token that we're referring to, the numbers.
Okay. So as you were detailing a little bit before, the type of persistent malware and backdoors we were talking about in this type of attack were based on both magic web and foggy web. So
Yeah.
how does that work in effect?
Yeah, so it's interesting to look at what the attackers would do once they'd gained access. So now they got access to somebody's Microsoft tenant. It really depends on who that user is in the organization. So if they're somebody with just a standard account, there's probably not a huge amount they can do. However, by default in Microsoft 365, if you have a valid user account, you're then able to attach devices, so you can add it as a managed device or an attached device to the Microsoft tenant, which is obviously how you can then, for legitimate reasons, you can then use that to maybe do things like bring your own device. So you could have a user who takes their own device into the office, and the company's got a BYOD policy, and it allows them to then attach any device to the Microsoft tenant using their account. You can do that by default. Obviously, there's mechanisms that you can use to prevent that, but essentially what the attackers were doing was they would then try and further their level of the attack, which would involve things like trying to attach a rogue device into the endpoint manager or the Microsoft Entra service within 365 in the tenant belonging to the victim.
Entra being Azure AD, as it used to be called.
Yeah, it's changed a lot. I logged in the other day and they've moved things around again. So
and renamed things yet again. Yeah, it's a common one, especially with the things like Priva and other naming conventions these days, where you don't know actually what party is called which these days.
Yeah, absolutely. We obviously, like yourselves, we advise customers on a lot of things around cloud and how they should set things up. And it's often when we're talking through it with a customer and you go to a place where you think, oh, hang on, Microsoft used to have it in here, that's moved now. So it tends to happen on a monthly basis. But yeah, I've digressed slightly. With regard to magic web and foggy web, so these are essentially two pieces of malware that have been produced and propagated around the world by the foreign intelligence services of Russia, allegedly. Magic web is essentially a good old Trojan type application. So it's there for creating that persistence into the compromised system. So it needs a compromised system first of all. So that might be through missing patches or social engineering or credential theft or something like that, which first gives the attacker access onto the workstation. Once they've got that access, if they're a standard user, they may use other vulnerabilities to elevate privileges to local system or to local administrator level, and then they can install the magic web malware onto the machine. It basically gives a backdoor to the attackers. So once that machine's compromised, the attackers need a way of getting back onto the machine to either exfiltrate more data or use that as a pivot point into other machines on the network. Really, once they've got remote access as a local admin, then the world's their oyster, essentially, from that point. They also use quite a lot of techniques from there to prevent detection. So that might include things like spawning new processes within the Windows operating system, injecting into existing processes, things like the LSAS process or some of the other, say a calculator app, say that was running, they might add that in. So it's less difficult, so it's less easy to detect it through detection software. With foggy web works in a slightly different way. So foggy web is again, it's Russian, allegedly Russian malware, which gets put onto machines as a way of exfiltrating data. Mostly what it focuses on, so it can be used, I believe, to exfiltrate any data. So you can just dump files off the operating system, and anything sensitive can be pulled off that way. But essentially, it's designed primarily to exfiltrate the configuration database of ADFS servers. So Active Directory, federated services. So these are essentially, again, if nobody's heard of these are essentially servers that sit in between a domain controller or a domain and other applications. So it's a way of authentication being federated through an intermediate server against Active Directory. So this might be, you might have an accounting app or something like that in a company where the payroll's done, for example. And when users log into that, they put in their Active Directory credentials. That goes through the ADFS server, which essentially checks that with the domain controller, which responds with a certificate or a token to say, yep, John Smith, he's all good. He can access this server.
Yeah, I think we've covered a bit of the federated services in one of our previous episodes on privileged escalation. I think, Pete, was that right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's so interesting. In this, it's a similar type of attack. It goes along the same sort of theme of compromising tokens, compromising certificates. So once, if you've compromised an ADFS server and you have the Kerberos tickets or the tokens that are coming back, essentially, if you have access to that token is valid for a certain period of time. So if that is compromised, essentially it allows the token or token decryption certificate to be stolen by the attacker and then used to authenticate against the services without needing a username or password, which is the scary part.
Yeah, I mean, it does beg the question as to how long these replay tokens can last for in terms of the sort of session length, really. But that's a whole different story, I suppose. So, I mean, to keep it simple, how far can a credential theft take a potential bad actor?
This is a really good question, Adrian. So it really depends on who that user is. And this, we've been banging the drum, all of us, probably for the last couple of decades on good use of usernames and user accounts and role-based access control. So if, for example, this was an organization which allowed their admins or domain admins, global admins in the case of Microsoft 365, if this was an account which had full rights to the entire domain, it could do anything. The account had the permissions to do absolutely anything. It was an administrator on, it's a global admin in Microsoft 365. That would essentially allow the attacker full access as that user, if no other protection mechanisms are in place. So I say that as a slight caveat. So certain functions of Microsoft 365 as an admin will prompt for re-authentication, which is when it's going to become slightly different for an attacker. So if they were then to go and start performing, what Microsoft would deem as a critical function of 365, it should prompt the user to re-authenticate. So if that's going to be something like, adding a new administrator account or accessing Microsoft Entra when maybe you hadn't done that already in that session, very often if the time between your login and the time before you've performed that administrative function is more than X amount of minutes, Microsoft prompt for a re-authentication with MFA. So that, unless there's other ways of getting the MFA tokens, that would potentially stop this type of attack in its tracks. But again, you don't know if the attackers, maybe the first thing they would do is log into the 365 tenant and then re-register the MFA app. So that would lock out the original user, the victim, and essentially give them persistent access into the 365 tenant. So that's quite a common thing to do. So
yeah, I've seen that happen. Certainly seen that happen before.
So we see this a lot actually in personal life as well. There's a friend of mine was locked out of his Facebook account. He was compromised on Facebook, and the first thing the attacker did was change the password, change the MFA method, the phone number, and all the stuff around it. So really, and also security questions for password reset. That's a common thing as well. So they'll change all of that so the victim has no way of getting back into their account. Now, if that's just to answer your question as well, Adrian, if that's, how far can that take a bad actor? Well, if that's a global admin of there's one guy that's got the global admin privileges and their account's been compromised and then subsequently locked out by the attacker, that's a really bad situation for an organization to be in.
Yeah, and they have that complete control of the tenant and any user or service related to that within that actual tenant. Yeah. Or associated tenants as well, I suppose. Yeah. Again, because you do have that amongst many different organizations of a larger nature usually. But yeah, some of them of a smaller nature have that capability. So yeah, that's very interesting. Just thinking of some ways that you could help prevent that sort of attack, really.
Yeah, interesting. So there's lots of, I think it's fair to say, so Microsoft, whether you like them or hate them, they have some really good security by default. So generally now, if you were to start up a new Microsoft tenant, it pretty much comes reasonably well secured out the box. We do a lot of Microsoft 365 reviews of customers. We do dozens of these every year, and generally it's when people start going in and changing settings and making mistakes during the configuration process and not knowing what the knock-on effect of that is. That's generally when we can see things being left absolutely wide open. So I would say by default, it's generally well secured. There's some bits that we always recommend, in line with CIS benchmarks and things like that you can sort of tighten down the security that's there already. I would say things that we see a lot. So SharePoint and OneDrive, pretty much by default, as it comes, allows you to share any data from your OneDrive with anybody outside the organization. That obviously leaves a huge hole open for maybe sending sensitive data outside of the organization. So that might be a password list that somebody's been keeping on their hard drive and they've shared it with somebody outside the organization, or a sensitive document maybe containing GDPR protected data or something like that. So by default, SharePoint's not particularly great. It's something that we always recommend customers lock down on, just to keep things nice and secure. MFA, we're actually at this point in time going off at a little bit of a tangent, but we're doing a lot of MFA reviews at the moment for a number of NHS trusts across England. So we've been drilling down quite deeply into the MFA methods in Microsoft 365 and other services also. But really, as a default tenant, a Microsoft 365 tenant will come with options like SMS messages, phone calls, and email, which obviously, if that's being received on a compromised device, so say say the user has set up for SMS messages, but then their phone hasn't got a PIN code on it, and you can just pick the phone up and get the SMS message. If the attacker is somebody that they know, it might be somebody in the office that's trying to compromise their account, and they've managed to pinch their phone off their desk for 10 minutes, then it's possible that MFA token could be compromised. Obviously, there are more secure options in there, so we always recommend that customers use the Microsoft Authenticator. Generally, when not
As
used
Microsoft do themselves, yeah.
Exactly. That's generally a really strong way of authenticating users, and also things like FIDO2 tokens. So we're big promoters of things like YubiKey. As well. They're dirt cheap. They're really easy to implement in Microsoft 365, with a bit of guidance, and they can be used as an MFA method also. They can also be used, just to promote YubiKeys again. They can also be used for things like passwordless authentication, so where you don't have to enter any credentials into the machine. So that prevents things like token, or not token, but credential theft, out of the LSAS process or out of malware and stuff like that.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, also you mentioned a bit beforehand, but probably another method that is generally encouraged by Microsoft these days is a zero tolerance approach to global administrator accounts and other higher level administrative privilege. So
Yeah.
again, that is another probably a good method to help prevent this sort of certainly higher tier of credential exploitation.
Yeah, there's so many features that you can add in, and I know a lot of these come with a licensing cost, good old Microsoft. But you have got things like PIM as well, so privileged identity management, where it essentially does just-in-time elevation. So if you've got a user that needs to go and fix a user's laptop, for example, instead of giving everybody, standard administrative access all the time, that access is granted on a case-by-case basis. So it might be something where you have an IT support person who needs to install some drivers for a printer on somebody's laptop. Well, they would request that access. That request gets approved, but it's only approved for a certain time period. So it might be approved for an hour, and then after an hour, the user's access on that machine drops back down to default user. And that just keeps everything, principal, least privilege, and all that as well.
Excellent.
Just a quick question, if I may. Otherwise, I'm just sitting here to look pretty anyway, of which I'm failing dismally. So just thinking about when you said that wave of attacks seem to be focused on small, medium enterprise and similar businesses. And do you think that's because they will tend to keep things very simple because they don't really understand how it works, that they're more likely to have unrestricted admin access, maybe even at the user level?
Yeah, that's a really good one. So we deal with a lot of small businesses, and I think there's definitely perhaps since COVID, I would say, there's a lot of businesses now where they don't necessarily have a centralized network. They're fully cloud-based. And one of the things we noticed with a lot of businesses during COVID, particularly small businesses, is their users were essentially just given a budget to nip down to PC World, pick up a laptop, and then start doing business stuff on it, which is obviously a really horrendous way of working from every different. I mean, we could almost do an entire podcast on that. But essentially, if you go to PC World and you pick up a laptop and you take it home, you're by default a local admin on that laptop. You can do anything you want on that laptop. Now, just because you add that into a Microsoft 365 domain, if it's added as a personal device and not as a company device, the company has no control over that laptop. And we see a lot of organizations operating like this, where essentially they've gone to an IT company somewhere, they've set their emails up for them, and then everything else is just accessed off of a combination of Macs, PCs, things people have bought on the internet, and it's just all accessing company data, which is just a huge security risk.
Right, and all just sharing a common pot for data, presumably.
Yeah, that's it. So the good point on that, Pete, really is that if the user has local admin rights, regardless of what the device is, if that device is compromised, then it essentially gives the attacker access to anything they want on that operating system. So in the case of this, we talked at the beginning of the podcast around session tokens. If that's a random PC World laptop that the user is using as a local admin, and maybe it's not been patched properly and they get compromised, that could still allow the attacker ways of getting session tokens out of the browser, which could also allow access to things like Microsoft 365 and anything else they're logged into. So it's probably another attack vector on that as well.
So again, another good protection mechanism for that would be good deployment of mobile device management systems.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it takes a bit of setting up in Microsoft 365, but generally once it's set up and the good set of policies are applied, which a lot of that now in Microsoft 365, you are prompted to set up security by default almost in many of those ways. Like you can incorporate CIS templates into Endpoint Manager to do things to an approved standard. Yeah, there's ways of securing things, and that's what companies should be doing.
Of course, you can also use other MDM tools that are out there. Macs particularly have other systems as well, and other elements, including I think the only one on the Mac side of things I've used recently is Jamf, where you can use both Intune and that together as well.
Yeah.
So again, they are some good combinations, I think, for MDM management in that one.
Yeah,
okay.
And it doesn't cost the earth either. I think one of the things that puts a lot of small businesses off is they look at something like that and they think, oh, that's going to cost me, $100 grand a year in licenses, and it's just it's not within our reach. MFA, but essentially you have to approve external chat messages. So it needs that to happen before the attacker can progress with the rest of the attack. So again, I think this comes down to security awareness training, making sure that your staff know what they should respond to and what they should probably ignore or report internally. And generally, 365, when you look at the Teams configuration, it's generally configured so that anybody outside of the organization can send messages in, but the user has to accept the message. So one of the things we suggest to customers as well is that you almost want to put a minimum set of privileges on that first of all, and then open things up to other users if you want to do that. So block access from external domains by default. And then if you've got maybe partners or customers or other suppliers that you'd want to be able to chat with, through Teams and have calls with, then you can open up to specific domains. And again, that just keeps things really well locked down. So in the case of this particular attack, because those, if the machines were set up, or the Intune and Teams were set up to only allow messages from recognized domains, in the case of this attack, the message would have never even reached the Teams client, so the user wouldn't have even known that the message had been sent, which is what you want. You want to try and protect users as much as possible.
Out of the box,
yeah.
Is it such that, so a small business getting involved with 365 in the first place, starting to use Teams, are their users able to authorize external people by default?
Yeah, by default, if it's a user outside of your domain, then it pops up with the message, and it says this person wants to chat with you, I think it is, and you can either accept, deny, or block. I think you've got some options at the bottom there. So again, it really ties nicely into the world of social engineering, Pete, because if it's very possible the attacker might go on LinkedIn, find one of the colleagues of the person they're attacking, and then pose as that user. So it's somebody that they know and they've already got maybe an existing trust with.
Right, and they don't understand that what they're doing is in fact enabling an external attack, because they recognize the name and they don't really understand what the prompts mean.
Exactly.
So, okay, thank
you. So it's some other good things really that you can implement to prevent this type of attack. Conditional access. I think we've touched on that briefly, but conditional access is generally available to all users of Microsoft 365. Essentially, how this works is it can be used to either lock systems down completely so that nobody outside of the organization can access internal resources, or it can be used to restrict access based on some sort of criteria. So just as an example of that, if you were if you had it locked down so that if the user was authenticating from an untrusted network, so one of the networks that was outside of the organization, you might want to enforce MFA. However, if the user is inside the office, which would be known as a trusted location, then maybe you wouldn't prompt for MFA or something else similar to that. The other thing which would be helpful in a situation like this, particularly when we're talking about session token theft and impersonation attacks, is you can actually lock down in conditional access. You can lock down session times, so session length. So Adrian, you mentioned session management earlier in the call. That's something you can do through conditional access. So that might be something where you lock it down so the session token is only valid for half an hour, and after that the token's invalid and it's going to be re-authenticated. That's quite useful. We see a lot of customers doing that for third parties. So if they have contractors or MSPs or somebody who's semi-trusted, they're outside of the organization, but they've obviously gone through some sort of due diligence, they'll often use that as a way of just restricting that account further. There's also threat scoring that 365 does quite well. So it looks for, I think what it terms as risky logins. So if the user account was being accessed from I don't know, Russia or China or somewhere that's considered necessarily an untrusted location, then it might increase the risk score based on other magic criteria that Microsoft has, and then it sees that as a risky login, in which case you can respond to that with conditional access and then maybe enforce MFA and a password reset or something like that, just to keep things secure. Data
Yeah, I think
leakage,
that's the nice thing about some of the security features and some of the default dashboards now in 365, where you can very easily see what's going on in terms of things like risky logins, and especially in terms of conditional access, where you've locked down to specific countries where your workers will be
absolutely.
working from, even though we have a lot more remote working these days after the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to want to use a VPN if I'm going to try and get around that then, right?
That's right. A VPN, Pete. Yeah, that's what you need. Great. And there's really two last things really of good things that customers can enable. One is again, it might need an E3 or an E5 license in some cases, but things like data leakage protection. That's very good at, I spoke originally about SharePoint default configuration allowing users to share data outside the organization. Actually, if you lock that down and you combine it with some of the data leakage capabilities of 365, you can actually lock down the types of data, or even down to strings. So you can lock it down to say that IP addresses can't be communicated outside of the organization via email or documents and things like that. So you can really do some tight lockdown on that.
Anything that contains financial data or even PII, which again, out of the
GDPR.
box wise, can work even with business premium licenses these days. So that is one thing that Microsoft did improve, that wasn't contained within their higher tiers of licensing.
Yeah, absolutely. And then my last one here was the information protection policies. They're a really good way for customers, and maybe larger customers that are considering ISO 27001, or just for sort of good data hygiene in the business. Having that information classification scheme, like public and private and restricted perhaps, you can enforce that within 365, so that every time you send an email or you save a document, it prompts you to categorize that document or the email, and then based on what the categorization of that is, it defines how that's going to be handled by either your email client or Word and Excel.
Yeah, that's definitely another podcast, because there we are touching upon information governance, and another one of our specialities that we like to talk about a lot. So yeah, that was really informative, Ian. Thank you very much for that.
No problem.
Terrific. I've learned a lot, Ian. Thank you very much indeed.
That's all right.
Thank you very much indeed.